Okay. I'll be sharing the screen. I hope you guys can see Cambridge. Okay. So we are going back. We are going to the beginning of it so that anyone who joins from the first slide is able to understand it. And for those who want to revise, this is also good. So the missing middle syndrome, it is given, this context is given for developing countries like India. When we don't debate about if it is developed or developing or what Trump decides. The missing middle syndrome is basically for third world countries who are developing. On one hand, you can see that there's this green colored slab in which there are hundreds and thousands of people, like your metro station at Rajiv Chowk, right? And in comparison, you have the Le Méridien or the Taj Hotel where you'll have 10 people, which is higher in strata, higher at height also, and higher in terms of the socio-economic capacity also, right? And you see that there's a difference, there's a missing piece here. There's one block which is missing that could connect both the lowest of the lows and the highest of the highs. So how can you see this in economy, the Indian economy? You can see this in the Indian economy where you see that once you get out of your house, you either go to your grocery store or your electrical or dry cleaner or any other kind of market. And on the other option which you have, if you have a lot of money or you have a lot of time, the other option that you have to go for is a mall. These are the two places where from which you can do your shopping, right? One is your normal shops from where you can go to Lajpat Nagar or Sarojini Nagar or these little shopping areas, Janpat, or you can go directly to, I'll go to DLF Mall Saket. There's nothing in between the two economic structures or two markets, certain kinds of markets in themselves. There's nothing in between. In America, it is worse. In most of the countries, like for example, if I want to get a needle, I have to go to a mall. There's no traditional shop or the concept of it. It is that the difference is that. And just as I was saying recently to a friend, to a student who wants to go to US, the first question I asked her was, "Do you know how to drive?" So she said no. So I said that in the public transport system is not good, like you have it in Delhi. The public transport system is not good. Everyone has cars. Even if you're an 18-year-old, you'll have a car. You have taken it on EMI, which will eventually have the credit crunch in the American economy. But the point is that okay, yes, we can discuss towards the end, but I don't think so. That is something. The annexation of West Bank is not something that can be explained in a, what do you say? Everyone, please check if you have muted yourself. Okay. So now we are going to, we'll see if we get time, if today everyone is also in the, it is lagging. Is it going very slow, Manse? For others, is it normal? The speed of the video is normal, or is it going very slow? Okay, let's see if I will do another recording of a YouTube for this in case if this doesn't come well. And then we can go ahead. Okay. So you can see the screen right now. There will be issues. Welcome to virtual reality. Okay. So we are here at the missing middle syndrome, which is that you have the missing block, right? So there's no extreme. You have either people who are there, and then we have a middle class, but just at the middle class, why don't you have a middle class economy in the sense of, in terms of a confederation or organization or a market structure which is able to link the FDI that we are getting from the American or the British or the European companies with the daily poor, very poor people of the country. So, and this is not a problem which is seen only in India, it is a problem that you will see in many of the third world countries, right? Because in the very nature of being a third world, you are anywhere at the green slab, and the orange one is the first world country. But even within your own country, you have this kind of hierarchy. So even in our country, we have Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, and then you have the second tier cities, and then third tier cities, villages, and all of that. So why so all of them will have their own kind of economy. Why are they not connected? Right? Talks about it. Joseph Stiglitz is a very famous American economist. He was born in 1943. He's a professor at Columbia University. He did his PhD from MIT. Then he was a research fellow at Cambridge University, UK. There is a Cambridge in US also. So he was in Cambridge University, UK. Then he came back, and after that he has been working with the World Bank, I guess. And then now he's a professor at Columbia University, very, very famous in terms of economic theories, talking about anti-IMF, anti-globalization critiques. So he says, because we have been talking about invisible hand. So he talks about that how recent advancements in economic theory have shown that whenever information is imperfect, information of what kind? So the first for a couple of words, the sentence mean recent advancement in economic theory. Who has done those advancements? So I have done those advancements. And who has given that kind of new idea of new lens of looking at it? So they have shown that whenever information is imperfect, there is a monopoly or control over information, right, with the market. So he says that when information is incomplete and your markets are incomplete, then most of the times in a developing country, your idea of invisible hand is not going to work perfectly. It will be imperfect. So for example, when pandemic is happening in India, do not have the idea that okay, it is the pandemic and some invisible hand is working and everything will be normal, right? So he'll say that this doesn't happen in a third world country because there are many other limitations also which are active, right? So if you're interested in studying critical side of IMF, exploitation works, why countries like India continue to stay in that periphery or semi-periphery, why do they continue? So if you want to study for your own good, you can refer to his books. So his books are basically taught a lot in Harvard and other places, and you can always go ahead with them. We come back to Ricardo. Now David Ricardo was a classical economist, and he was born in 1772. He died in 1823. So he lived for 51 years. He wrote two books. One was The High Price of Bullion, which was 1810. Not the price, it was the year. 1810 was when he wrote it. And the second book that he wrote was Principles of Political Economy and Taxation in 1817. In the language of econ, which is economics, you have the short form for this book called as The Principles. You don't go ahead with the Wealth of Nations is a short form, so The Principles is a short form. So what do we remember about David Ricardo? We remember that he was born in a Jewish family that had migrated from Netherlands. He was born in London. He had his parents had 17 kids. He was the third. He, by the age of 14, he was made, when you guys would have been in your 6th, 7th standard, he had joined the stock exchange, London Stock Exchange, and he was working and helping his father. Now what started happening was also that he at the age of 21 he fell in love, and then he left his family abandoned him, so he had to start his own stock exchange business, which he started because there were banks which came ahead and supported him. In 1815, you had the Battle of Waterloo, right, on 18th of June. So 8 days after today. So what happens in Battle of Waterloo is that Napoleon is defeated, irrespective of the fact that Napoleon had the highest number of people in his army, the best kind of gunpowder, cavalry, everything. So this was going very counterintuitive, something which you have your intuition says that this is going to be the result of whatever is happening, and the result is completely opposite. So you'll call the result as counterintuitive. So in that case, what happens is that he makes a lot of money. He had betted that no, the seventh coalition is going to defeat Napoleon. Obviously, why? Because David Ricardo is not as enamored to Napoleon as Hegel was. That, oh, I have to just submit my book right now, but let me have a look at you entering Vienna, right? So he's not that enamored. He's critical of whatever is happening, and he's able to give an entire idea of many things which were happening during 1815-16, and he made a lot of money. What does he do with a lot of money? He gets a farmhouse or a very nice country house, and he has a house in London. He has 8 kids, and then he buys a seat in the Parliament, which is the House of Commons of UK. And after that, he also was very anti-slavery, right? And he also understood that technology has a negative impact, because at that time what was happening was the industrial revolution was in its very nascent phase. So what was happening at that point of time is that during that stage, the challenges which capitalism was facing or what was happening were much more new. So now what was happening, that Ricardo was able to understand, he was able to, like, when you look back at that time and say that, oh yes, central banking is important, oh yes, there's a depreciation or inflation or price rise which happens with cash or money which goes up. At that time, those theories were not made. It was the first time when, everything was very rudimentary in its very nascent stage. So Ricardo was able to write about the Bank of England and the policies of it. He was also talking about taxation. He also talked about government bonds and everything, which we are not discussing in this class, but he wrote about a lot of things in his books. So, and we also have to understand when we are studying Ricardo, that Ricardo was not writing in a very flowery language. He was not writing in a very academic language. So that does not mean that it is easier to understand, because Ricardo doesn't have the training in writing and conveying his thoughts. So it might happen that it is difficult to understand, right? So here we come to labor theory of value. So as a student, you should, whenever you think about Ricardo or whenever you think about any economist, the economist and the they gave should come simultaneously in your mind. So what did Ricardo really talk about? He talked about comparative advantage. He talked about the rent theory, and why he talked about his own labor theory of value, which was a step higher than Adam Smith, quote unquote. And we also talk about that why he's talking, because he was anti-mercantilism. He was anti-economic protection. He was a classical economist. So he believed in free trade, that every country should have free trade. So why is it very important to study him? Because then he'll give you a reason why countries should trade. And trade is a very strong part of international relations, right? There's one way of studying IR, which is through you being a student of BA political science and then going for MA political science, or then getting on to MA IR, then doing an area specialization in your MPhil or PhD. The other way of studying IR is through economic background. Both of them are, but you work in a think tank. So the economic angle of IR has more gravity over there, especially in the Western countries. Okay. So now we are going to talk about the most important things of his concepts. It's going to be a bit long class. So be ready, take notes. If you don't understand anything, you can ask me towards the end of this in the question answer session. And we are going to start away with labor theory of value, which Adam Smith said. What did Adam Smith say? He said that if this is a cup, the price of it is the labor that has gone into producing it. That is what Adam Smith said, that everything is in the price that you pay is the price that you're paying for the labor that has gone into creating it, is the idea of Adam Smith in a very simplistic manner. So then the question that we were basically, having a difficult time with was that why can't my maid afford a maid, or why can't my construction agent, my mistri, my plumber afford a plumber or a mistri, or why can't they? It's not about choice. Can they afford it? The answer is that. So for example, if I'm teaching you and I'm getting my salary out of it, but I can afford to have the admission of my own kid in another school, I can afford that, right? If I don't want to, I want to homeschool them, that's a different choice. But do I have the option? Yes. But why doesn't my maid have the option? So we also understood, which was, see, beautiful but exploitative at the same time, which was that you don't own everything. What has happened with capitalism is that you don't own anything or everything, nothing you own. So say for example, I want to paint on a canvas and I say that this is my own creation, I own it, right? But you can't paint if there is no canvas, no brush, no color. As simple as that. And you have not created them, you have just created the painting that the idea came in your mind. So you don't own it. So if you have a byline in a newspaper and then you'll say that this is mine. No, it's not yours. There's so many other, there's the entire editorial machinery which is involved. But the interesting thing is that even they don't own it, right? Or if you become a CEO, if you become a CEO, if you become a CEO of a startup, say Ola or say Ola or Zomato, CureFit, Flipkart, whatever. Your entire decision of doing anything is dependent on the kind of fund you're getting from the venture capitalists or the investors who are investing in your company. So you don't really own it, right? So there is nothing. Why did this entire idea that a man cannot make everything in an object? Like there will be a different man who will make the cup. There's a different man who will make the, though machines are working now, but then the idea is that why there are different people involved or different parts of the machine, because that idea of specialization was given by Adam Smith. Adam Smith said that, the more people are coming together and working in specialization, the advantage of that will be that you're going to produce more. Here I'm not talking about quality at all. Adam Smith is not talking about quality, I'm not talking about quality. I'm talking about the units of production which are more in quantity. Understand this, because in capitalism, the entire idea of capitalism, like when you feel that you have been nabbed in 9 to 5 jobs, right? Does it add to a quality of life? Not really. And also we as humans have the tendency to say that no, something which was very good 1 year back would not have a value addition after 1 year, right? So the point is that I'm not talking about quality and I'm not talking about merit. I'm talking about maximum production in least amount of time, right? And that is why you need specialization. Now understand, this is a construction site. On your screen you can see the slide, which is of a construction site. There are so many women, so many labor women employed, right? Then you see that there's a building, then there are bricks, then there are these what do you say, mixing machineries, there are there's land, yes, then there is this entire rope and all these bricks which are creating it. There is the building, half of it is there, there's space, there are many things involved. These women should have the access of transportation to come and work there. There should be no pandemic, that they should, everything should be normal, right? They have to the situation, the space should be empowering enough for them to earn. They're not earning a lot of money. And the idea is also not to construct Taj Mahal, but the idea is to construct this building in the lowest, amount of time investment, more people, labor intensive, you can see it is, and less amount of time. And the finesse should be there. But what we're talking about is that the value of this building is going to be much more quantified than quality, which we are going to talk about. So here we come to production. So when you produce something, labor, as we saw in that picture, you need women, men, laborers, right? Then you need materials or tools in which you can work. So if I want to do construction, then I need so many other materials to do the construction work with. I can't do it with my hand, right? I will need cement, I'll need sand, I'll need many other things, right? Along with the tools which are there. And then you also need factories where those cements and those tools are produced so that eventually you can use it, right? So what is, there's a part of dead capital which is coming over, indirect labor is coming over here. What is indirect labor? So Amar Khan asked this very important question, right? That the watch is, my watch says the same time, your watch says the same time. So why should you go ahead and buy a very expensive watch? Why a brand? So the answer to it is indirect labor, right? It is indirect labor or indirect capital. Why we are using these words interchangeably, we are going to discuss it in this class, but it is indirect. Why is it indirect? Say, for example, the first time when Apple launched its first phone, it used a certain amount of technology which was ahead of its time. Every time Apple launches a new phone, the technology which is used in the Apple iPhone is better and superior. So you're not only paying when you're buying the Apple phone, you're not only paying for that Apple phone, you're paying also for the indirect labor that has gone for all these years since Apple was invented, right? Since that time, from the time it was invented till now, the indirect labor which has been done by millions of people who might not even be alive right now, you're also paying for that. And that is the USP of it, which is indirect labor. In property or in economics, what happens is that dead capital is that capital which you don't know the owner of, right? So for example, when I'm paying 100 rupees for this bottle, it's a new bottle. When I'm paying 100 rupees for this bottle, I'm just not paying for the labor that has gone in making this by the people who made it, but also I'm paying for the person or for the entire history of the idea of making a bottle. That is dead capital. And that, what Marx will say is, this is how people make profit, because you don't have an owner, it is very ambiguous. But coming to that, so there's a certain amount of indirect labor which is also there. So here we understand that the means of production are actually products of another labor practice. So if I want to use cement, I want to use sand, I want to use any bricks, there is a manufacturing industry for manufacturing cement. If there was no manufacturing industry or factory to make cement, I couldn't construct my house. As simple as that. So even the products of one particular means of production, the product of one particular means of production is all which is being used for another means of production. There is this continuous line which is there. So you're not just paying for the labor, you're paying also for the capital which is there, plus the indirect capital. So we'll come to the definition of capital also. So here it is said, so labor processes the means of production that already exist and has value. So if this cup is made of porcelain, understand the concept. If this cup is made of porcelain, then there is an industry that makes porcelain, which is very different from the industry that makes cup. These are two different industries. If the porcelain making industry didn't exist, I couldn't have had a cup. I could have had a plastic cup, but then you need a plastic making industry for that. Understood? So I will go deeper into these concepts. It gets difficult to understand, and I understand it. But we are just trying to introduce ourselves to the concept of looking at what really things are made of. Anything that is making a thing is already a part of something else which has been made by it, is the concept, basically. So there are other kinds of labor also, like air, sunlight, uncultivated land. Right now in the pandemic, there was no construction work happening, or there was no metro happening, or metro travel happening, or still not happening. And things where, in spite of the labor being present and in spite of the space being present, the land being present, in spite of both the things being present, we were not able to have those functions. Why? Because these are what? These are believed to have no value, but they actually are. I can't go ahead and start making cup of tea in darkness. I need light. There's an entire electricity is a different subject altogether, right? So all of this is what? It is constant capital. We take it as constant, that okay, whenever we assume that if we are talking about something, there must be air, there must be sunlight, there must be light, there must be electricity. We are taking it all constant. We just saw that we can't take electricity as constant, but the fact is that we normally take it as it is an assumption whenever we make a theory. So we go forward. What is capital then? So think about these terms like Delhi is the capital of India, or capital punishment. The word capital is used several times, but very often we don't know what it really means. So capital is basically, the origin of the term capital is from a Latin word, capitale, which basically means caput. Caput is your head. Don't pronounce it and say that kaput bol rahe the, kaput nahi bol rahe the, it's caput, okay? So it is your head, anything which is moving. Labor can move, right? Anything which is moving and is part of the head. So head is the most important part of your body. So anything which is very important moves. That was capital during the 12th, 13th century, which I'm talking about. So your term like cattle has a kind of, if you study about the words and the origin of words, so the word cattle also comes from this Latin word of capitale, right? So what it is something which is movable, an asset which can move, right? So don't say that, the Delhi can't move, it is the capital, right? But the idea is that but then in capital punishment, capital here means what? Right? So for example, what is capital? There are many, very easily we say terms like social capital, political capital, oh my god, so much of capital, right? But we don't understand it. What is capital? The simplest definition of capital is assets that can enhance one's power to perform economically useful work. I believe that I'm teaching right now, it is economically useful, right? And my asset right now is what? Laptop, electricity, internet is my what do you say? Asset. Zoom is an asset. So I will call them as capital for me. We often say that, okay, if I go to a foreign country, I should have social capital. What does that mean? Why should I have social capital? Social capital there means better networking connections so that eventually you can make more profit and go up in the hierarchy. So for example, for a hunter, the arrow that he uses is capital. The tools that he's using is capital. For a road, for a village where you have road, these are very simple examples taken from Wikipedia. For a simple village which is there, if they don't have a road, a proper road, then they won't have proper transport. Don't have proper transport, then they will not be able to migrate, or apart from we'll walk, but they need proper lifestyle, right? But so in that case, the road is an asset. So the road is the capital. My laptop is a capital for me, right? Capital is increased from labor and duration of production. Capital is increased from labor and duration of production. I am not talking about quality of production. I'm talking about duration of production, which means that land, for example, you will not say that land is capital because land you have not created. Land has been given to you by God. It is part of nature. Till now, we cannot also create land. We can go to moon, but we cannot create land as such. So we don't. So what is capital? Capital is something which can be increased by increasing the labor. You can have more people and have a better building, but you cannot have more people and have a better land. There's no instruction to that. So capital, your land is not your capital. It is a part of nature. But whatever tools that you use, that is capital. Adam Smith gave this definition that the part of man's stock which he expects to afford him revenue. Anything that affords revenue, you are using it, that is capital. It can be a tool, it can be a tool, it can be an asset, it can be tangible, intangible, right? Intangible is what? Like air, water, electricity, all of that, wind, oxygen. We assume that it is there, right? So that is what? Capital. You need it, it is needed to have any kind of progress and development in your life. But we take it as constant. Ki ye to hoga hi, right? So Ricardo talks about something called as productive capital. He talks about more input. He says that, okay, I have to make this cup. He imagines that the process eventually, what is the process? That I want to produce this cup. So what do I need? I need color, paint, I need porcelain, I need some factory which can, give structure to some machine that can give structure to this cup in this way. What are these things? These are inputs. These are also assets, but these are also input. इनके बिना, इनके input के बिना आपका काम नहीं होगा. Your work will not be done, right? So that, he says, is productive capital. Why is Ricardo famous? Ricardo is famous because what he does is that he gives the entire idea of your capital getting quantified. This idea of quantity, I am telling you again and again that I'm not talking about quality. This quantification of capital, quantification of assets, that I should have this more, consume more, have accumulation, have this more, you'll have this tool more, better you'll have in terms of number, then you will be able to produce more, have more people doing your work. This quantification, this accumulation, this idea was given by Ricardo, right? And Marx will say, capital is money used to buy something only in order to sell it again and make a profit. So he says that cash, money, gold, silver, whatever, is capital. What I am trying to say is that what Adam Smith and what Ricardo or the other believers of capitalism had said when capitalism had started or industrial revolution had started was the very fact that it is money. It is also the tool, the input that you're putting in that process. That is capital. Yeah, you need it. You can get it only through money. You have to pay for it, right? But money and the modes of production. So that's where the famous idea of modes of production comes over, right? So here you have the equation. All of you should write it down, which says C plus L is equal to W. This is the idea, basic idea. This formula basically states that C is the constant capital. Constant capital is what? Air, water, wind, oxygen. I take it as constant. Constant capital plus material tools. So I want to have this teacup made. So I need material tools. I need machines that mold it in this way. I need machines that can print this graphic art. I need machines that can, make porcelain in that way that it becomes a cup. All of that. I need an entire industry and agency for that. So those material goods are also a part of your capital. Plus, that depreciated portion of that tool. So say, for example, if I want to have a cup of tea, I need a pan to make a cup of tea. I need that, right? Or if I want to cook, I need a gas stove. The first day when you get a gas stove or a fridge or whatever, it's so beautiful. And the second day, if you try to clean it, and even if you promise yourself you'll clean it, you can't properly, because with time it gets dirty. Not that it doesn't, doesn't work. The pan will still give you tea. You can still make tea, but it won't look as shiny and bright. The impact or the quality of it will go down. That is why we say that never buy cars and mobile phones or anything in technology on EMI, because you end up paying more for something which is depreciating. The moment you buy a technology, its value starts depreciating, right? That is the very nature of technology, that it keeps on changing. So the moment you're buying something, you're paying for something, for a good which you have bought on EMI, but you're paying more for it with interest and everything else, right? And then you also need factories where the porcelain is made. Porcelain making industry is something else. The steel making industry is something else. Iron making industry is something else, right? So this is what? This is capital. All of this is capital. Then comes labor. So I will need a person who will also supervise the making of the cups, and different people according to their specialization. So quantity of labor. Quantity of labor is what? Your combination of average skill and average productivity. Again, I am talking about quantity, and I'm using the word average. I have not talked about merit, quality, or superb production of something, right? That is what people say, no, this is beyond my job description. Why? Because the work is to be done in a particular duration, in a particular manner. Quality is not a part of this production. So this is a very interesting article which I'll share on Twitter about how, when the industrial revolution started, your structure of schools that you have and the structure of education that you have, which our concept of fluid learning is trying to fight with, the idea of this entire school system, college system, education system, which is also there in India and other countries, this started happening. This started happening where? In the industrial revolution in the first world countries. What happened was that students were seen as raw goods. Students, I'm very sorry, but students were seen as raw goods. They were put into a factory, which was a school, college, whatever, eventually to come out as a product which will be a part of the market. Now, what are the basic factory model of education which started with the industrial revolution? What is the basic idea of it? The basic idea of it is that every kind of student that I am producing is ek jaisa hai, homogeneous, because I'm using average skill and average productivity to change the lives of students through teaching or education, which is would be very average not ideology, but in reality, it is a factory model, like a machine. The college, school, primary school, university is creating you, and then you are part of the market. So it's not only about the Indian education system where you can debate with. If you want to debate about the idea of education, you have to go back to the industrial revolution. If there would have been no industrial revolution, maybe we would have a different kind of teaching pedagogy, like the Gurukul, or in the Chinese culture. And W here is what? Value or worth of that product, right? Here I'm not saying price. I'm saying value or worth of that product. C is capital labor. C is your capital, constant capital, plus your indirect capital, plus the depreciating value of something, right? And then L is the quantity of labor that has gone. W is the value, which is, so W is equal to C plus L. This is what Ricardo is saying. Your maid is not able to earn or afford a different maid because you have a particular, so for example, if I have a maid, I'm giving her a space. I'm giving her the materials that she can use for cleaning, cooking, anything that she's doing, dusting. Above all, I'm giving her my flat where she can exercise that. Your own maid might not have, she might have the labor, right? But she might not be able to afford a flat like me. She might not be able to afford the tools which are necessary, which I'll get from very expensive brands and everything. She might not be able to afford it. So it's not, what I'm trying to say, that she's not only not able to afford a maid for herself, she's also able to afford so many other tools which we take as very granted, right? Why? Because it is not only about labor. So Ricardo is saying, Adam Smith said that everything is about labor. The cost or whatever value of this is the labor that has gone. So if it is 100 rupees, so 100 rupees will go to the laborer. But Ricardo will say that no, laborer will get around what? 30, 40 rupees out of it. 60 rupees has to go for the entire means of production, from where you get the porcelain, from where you get, the graphic art, from where you get the molding. So the labor is only a little part of it. And that was the problem of capitalism, which could have been seen at that point of time, that labor was only a part of it. So when you're talking about, you're putting the labor or the person who is doing labor in a lower hierarchy, the very moment you are taking away the right of, trade union or right of choosing any kind of empowerment, because the answer will be that, look, you are a part of the system. You don't create the system. The system has been created by those owners of factories, those capitalists, but you are only a part of it. So what kind of revolution do you want? Right? So this is why your maid will never be able to have a maid. Or your driver will not have a driver because he can't even afford a car. With Uber, for example, so many drivers came ahead and they are, it's a new kind of job. But they are buying cars which they could have never afforded, paying EMIs which they cannot pay at, because of so many issues and limitations in life, which they could have never afforded anyway. But Uber is, the entire money which Uber gives them is not the car ride that you pay for. There are cuts in. They don't get, if there's a ride which you have from A to B location, your driver is not going to get 500 rupees or 300 rupees in his account. And even if, say, that they are getting 500, they have to pay EMI for the car. There's no profit for them. They can never afford a driver, right? So this is the entire exploitative structure. So you start with a cup of tea. So my favorite, you can see a cup of tea, you can see this pan, pot, right? When I want to have a cup of tea, what do I need? I need a cup. I need a gas cylinder. I can't start making tea out of air till now. I need sugar. I need milk. I need a place in the kitchen if I want to, hygienically make, right? I need to have oxygen, air, sunlight, all of that. In a simple thing like tea, which takes hardly 5 minutes. If it takes more for you, then maybe you're better at it. So what a tea maker is doing, the tea maker is adding value. When you make tea, when you combine all these things together, like tea, sugar, milk, water, when you combine and you make tea, you're making a different product. It is a mixture of tea, sugar, whatever, and it is a different product. You're adding value to it. You're adding more worth to it, right? If you just, instead of 1 cup of sugar, you put 5 cups of sugar by mistake, then you are devaluing it, right? No one can drink it. You have to throw it. So, but at the same time, the value of cup, the value of the pot, the value of gas cylinder, the value of, the uh, everything that you're using, the tools that you're using, they're depreciating. The value here in terms of cost price also. So, for example, if you want to go ahead and I just got a new cylinder today, and after 2 days I decide that no, I need another cylinder, or no, I'll have a pipe in my house then, and you want to sell it for the amount of money you got. So say you got it for 1,000 rupees or 2,000 rupees. Even after 1 day of use, if you want to go ahead to the market and sell it back, you cannot sell it for 2,000 rupees. The value has gone down in price, right? So whenever you exchange something, I cannot go and say that, oh, I bought this phone for 10,000, I'll sell it for 10,000 only, right? So why? Because the cost price in terms of value, cost price in terms of value has gone down, right? Here what I'm doing is value of T. What is the value of T that I'm having? It is the value of my labor and the newly added value by workers intensity and duration. So the value of example, when I cook for myself initially, I always found it torturous, right? But then one of my aunts said that, there is this idea that when you cook your own food, it is always more tasty. And I was like, wow, okay, is it so? So every time I make very bad food, I tell myself that, look, there's an idea that if you cook your own food, you'll like it. So you're adding value to it. So value of the tea is value of my labor. I took 5 minutes of my time and then I made ahead and made cup of tea, right? Plus the new value of all these ingredients that I've added, right? So that is why the same. For example, if you'll have a cup of tea in my house, you'll have it for free, most probably. If you have it in JNU, you'll have it for 5 rupees. And if you go to the Taj Hotel, you'll have it for 500 rupees. Why? The labor is having some, like, the person who is making cup of tea must have done PhD in culinary science there, right? So more, the labor is more and the value that he's adding is more. That he can have a master class also now. But you can't go to the JNU Dhabas chai wala and say, ki, Acha, you start a master class, even though he might have more years of experience, right? So there is this hierarchy of labor also, and the value that the worker's intensity and duration is added. Intensity and duration. I'm still not talking about the quality. I'm only talking about intensity and duration. So more amount of tea in less amount of time. Someone who can multitask and make a lot of tea will have more value than me who can just have one cup of tea in 5 minutes, and that too, even though I'll have it 100 times a day, right? So here we come to the concept of labor's time and duration, right? So say you go to a canteen. All of you have colleges, all of you have canteens, right? Don't tell that I'm telling this, because then if I want to come to your college, then I won't get tea, right? But I'm telling you about the economic system over here. The first point is that if you have a canteen, say in your canteen you have 20 people who are working. There are 20 men who are working in your canteen. Now they are paid, say, 500 rupees a day. Say they are paid, that's, I'm speaking at a very high margin, but let's say that they are paid 500 rupees a day. That is the variable capital. That canteen sells one cup of tea for 10 rupees. So they are getting 500 rupees a day in the wage. But if you go to a roadside chai wala thela where you get it rupees, the wages will be different, right? So what is that? That is variable capital, keeps on changing. Now surplus labor portion is what? Surplus labor portion is that when, say for example, I have a canteen and I have 10 people making a cup of tea and serving you. The other person who is there, who owns another canteen, might have 50 people, so he'll have more profit. even if he also sells the same cup of tea for 5 rupees. Why? Because there are more people, there's more production of tea, so if say they have this kind of tea thing in front of a stadium, and I have a tea canteen in a college, definitely there'll be more. If there's a cricket match, so definitely people are going to come and have more tea. Right. So in that context, the surplus labor portion, the profit which is made, the profit is made by person who owns the canteen and not the laborer. The laborer does not. The tea maker, the bhaiya who gives you tea in your canteen, he is not making profit out of it. The person who owns it is going to make profit out of it. So technically, you will say that no, it is the canteen owner. No, the canteen owner has applied for a tender given by your university, college, or that particular part of government or private infrastructure. Whoever owns the land is basically owning it. You see the hierarchy? Now, there's a difference between, we are saying it very interchangeably, but there's a difference between the terms like price, cost, and value. Price is what you pay. So the price of it is something 100 rupees. This is what I paid for buying it. Cost is the amount of inputs needed. For people who have done math, basically it is just like that, you know, I needed plastic, I needed this another kind of cup, the cover of it, I needed different kinds of things to make this uh, product. So from the side of the owner, that is what is it costing you to make it. So the cost price will comparatively be less, but the price that you are paying, the sale price or selling price, is going to be more. And that is how you make profit, right? And value is the worth and utility, which you always have in the future. Value and worth, which is worth and utility, you always have in the future, which we have discussed in the one of the previous classes. Now we are coming to rent theory. So his labor theory is over. What are the basic parameters of his labor theory? The basic parameters of his labor theory are that, first, he says that any product that has been created, it does not only refer to the labor that has gone into it. There's also capital. Capital is what here? It is the means of production or the tools that have gone into that. Capital can be constant, which is air, water, sunshine, whatever. It can be variable, more people, less people, more tools, less tools, right? Or it can also be indirect, which is, oh, the entire history of making cup of tea is also included in the price that you're paying for it, right? So these are three categories of it. C is your worth or your utility is equal to C plus L, which is capital plus labor. Understood this? He also says that there is quantification of labor. He always talks about intensity and duration. So say, for example, there is Amartya Sen coming and teaching or in JNU or in Jamia. He's coming and teaching in any university. And then there are 5 ad hocs who are also there teaching the same class. Amartya Sen is teaching you and 5 ad hocs are teaching you. I'm not saying anything condescending. I'm just saying in terms of, like, think about it. Now, all of them go on a strike that we are not going to teach. Even though Amartya Sen might have more quality, more in-depth understanding of the concept, he might have more Nobel, like he might be much more famous and, you know, very difficult to get to. But for the university, because these are 5 ad hocs and this is one person, the loss of 5 laborers is going to be much more difficult. Are you understanding? More laborers are what? Ad hocs. So in that reason, I'm talking only about quantity. And I want to educate a lot of students in the least amount of time. I want to produce a lot of goods in the least amount of time. I want to produce a lot of masks during the time of pandemic. I want to produce a lot of, there's panic buying. So I want to produce a lot of grocery items during the pandemic in least amount of time, right? So he's talking about intensity and duration. Average skill, average quality, maximum output in terms of quantity, not quality. The labor is the entire system, laborer is a part of it. So the proletariat is only a part of the system. The entire system is not governed by him. Yes, he plays a very pivotal role. He might, if you think of it in a master slave dialectics, right? If the proletariat is not there or the working class is not there, then you won't have the system. That is why you had the trade unions coming and protesting and having this unity of intent. But the point is, what do they want to overthrow? You want to overthrow the entire system in which you have this differentiation between the owner and the worker. There's no conception of owner and worker at all. You want to create a system like that. Today, for example, when you have so much of racist discourse happening, if you want to take over the system or have revolution in the idea of living, then you want a colorless society, that the color doesn't even, everyone is of the same color, at least in the idea, the metaphor I'm talking about. You don't have the differentiation. If you don't have the differentiation, you won't have racism, you won't have the protest movements, right? So that is what his labor theory of value is. The main thing that you have to take out of it is that any product that has been created, it has two things. One is capital and the other is labor. That is why your laborer is not getting 100 rupees. If you're buying something in Fab India, then you're buying it for 2000, but the person who has made that kurta will not get 2000 rupees, right? So this is the culture of capitalism that later Karl Marx is going to talk about, how this is exploitative. Now we come to the second idea of it, which is the rent theory of Ricardo. Rent theory is also it's very difficult to understand. So I'll go a bit slow and we'll try to explain it, that what it means. Here, don't think of rent as the rent you pay to your landlord. That, okay, it is the first day of the month, I have to pay the rent for this flat. No, we're not talking about that rent. So take out the concept of rent. When I'm talking about this slide, you don't know what this rent means. You have no idea what this rent means. It is not the rent that you're paying to the landlord. Nothing else. Right? So what it is, we have to start thinking about. The basic question that we will start with is that imagine if you had to pay price to breathe air, if air was not free. हम जो सांस लेते हैं, it is free right now. Imagine if air was not free. Air is unlimited in supply. That is why we are like, okay, not during the time of Delhi winter, but the point is that air is still free. What if you had to pay for air? What will happen? You're going to start wearing those masks that you wear in space. Not you, but astronauts. And you have to attach it always to your body. You have to, always keep on adding air in it as you add money in your balance phone, right? You're buying it, it becomes a commodity. Right now, rent is not a commodity. Air is not a commodity, right? So now we come when it becomes a commodity. Air does become a commodity. Look at the air purifier. During winter in Delhi, most of the people go ahead and buy air purifier. You're purifying the air, right? It is a tool that you're paying for. You can buy it on rent or you can get it on like 10,000, 5,000, whatever, full price. But you're paying for it, right? It became a commodity. Because then what is the idea here? That pure air is not free. Right? This is the idea. Even these plants that you buy that are air purifiers, you have to buy it. You have to pay money for it. Right? So here comes the concept of how air is different from land. Look at this picture. Land on earth, at least right now, is limited. In all the countries, the lands, that's why we have so much of border wars, because everyone wants to increase their land and borders, right? So land is what? It is the entire amount of land that you have on earth is limited. If land was unlimited, just like air, I'm talking about any kind of land. If the entire idea of land was limited, and we had not gone back to that time when, or, we are discovering about whether what is the geography, what is the earth is flat, earth is round, earth is moving around sun, sun is moving around moon. I'm not talking about science. I'm saying if we are still in the process of not understanding it and seeing it as unlimited, like your universe is unlimited. So think of an idea where you thought that land was unlimited and it was everywhere, it was in a very good quality, right? In that case, land would have been free. You would not pay for using a land. Today, you pay for using any kind of land, even if you are parking somewhere, your car, if you want to go to a mall, you're using a tiny bit of land over there. You're paying for it. If you want to have a flat and you also want to have a garage, you'll pay more to the flat maker or the builder. If you buy a flat or whatever in the land, now we're having apartments which are beyond in air, right? You're paying even for that, right? So the idea is that what Ricardo said, that if land was unlimited and the quality of land everywhere was unique and uniform and good, here he's talking about quality, right? So if the quality was okay, fertile, all of that, then what would have happened is that you wouldn't have to pay for land. इतना ज़्यादा है, इतना ज़्यादा है. Why do you have to pay? It is unlimited. It is free, just like air, right? But it is not so. We have two kinds of cultivation. So what Ricardo says, that land has there are two kinds of economy, he says. One is the industrial economy, which is aided with your international trade and all of that. And the other is the agricultural economy. And when in talking about agricultural economy, he says that there are two kinds of cultivation. One is that cultivation. More land is used to increase production. There are two ways of. So for example, I want to produce more of mangoes. One way I can have more mangoes is by having more land where I can grow mangoes. Or I can have the intensive cultivation where I have more laborers who are, employed to have the mango extracted in the same place, but in a better way. That is labor intensive. So Ricardo often talks about extensive cultivation. He's talking about more land or limitation of land. He's not talking only about labor and capital in land when he's talking about rent. So every economic theory works on certain kinds of assumptions. There are assumptions that are there in every kind of economic theory. The first assumption that he says, now why do you have assumptions? Why? The reason is I told you that theories are utopian. They are not connected with the real world. It is an assumption of looking at life. It is a paradigm of looking at life. It is a concept of looking at life. It might be true, it might not be true. That is why, a political philosopher comes, gives a theory, then he dies. Then there's another political philosopher comes who gives a critique of that theory, then he dies. Or maybe he's alive, and then there are many other philosophers who are there who are ready to ransack his idea, right? Why? Because it's all theoretical, it's not praxis. So in theory, you always give assumptions so that you are able to add gravity to your theory. So the first assumption is that rent of land arises due to difference in fertility. What is the nature of it? We are going to come to it. Second, he says law of diminishing returns. What it is, we are going to come to that also. And third key is that land is not, as I said, that land is capital. Land is a gift of nature. How do you define supply price or demand price of land, which you haven't even created? You might own it, but you have not created land. No zamindar has created his land, right? He might create a better agricultural output out of that land or utilize it better, but he has not created land. Ki chalo chalo, aaj we are going to create earth, land, mitti. You can't do that. So all of it, whatever is being created, or the produce of that land is, all of that is surplus. Because आपका तो कुछ पैसा ही नहीं लगा उस land को बनाने में. No money was invested to make that land, right? So whatever comes out of land is surplus only, right? So in this case, these are the assumptions. You don't have to agree with it. You can finish the lecture and think about it and critique it and all of that. I want you to critique it because obviously this is when in 17 and you are in 2020. So you obviously have to critique it. But I'm saying that these are the assumptions that Malthus was, when he was talking about, Ricardo was talking about. Now, what is the law of diminishing returns? So I keep telling you that till 1750, till 1800, what was happening in this world? Irrespective of so many, colonialism happening, discoveries happening, what was happening in this world? There were a lot of pandemics happening. I'm not trying to use it as a metaphor, but there were a lot of pandemics happening, right? A lot of pandemics were happening, people were dying, there was scarcity. Because of the scarcity of food, people were not able to survive, right? So what was happening is that there was a trap that was not letting the population to go up or evolve. There was so much of starvation, people were dying because of the resources, lack of food. This idea was given by a student of Adam Smith called as Malthus. This is known as Malthusian trap. Now, Malthus was a very good friend of R. Ricardo. Okay. So here you see, what is the law of diminishing returns? It is with life. Life itself is a law of diminishing returns. How? Okay. So say, for example, there are three categories of land. One is very fertile, it is my first choice. The second is less fertile, it is my second choice. The third is least fertile, it is my third choice. But all three are available to me and I can still do some amount of agriculture. We'll go into this in the next slide also, but over the period of time, you'll see that this entire structure of land that you have will start giving you less output. Less output can be because of many reasons. The fertility you're using the wrong kind of manure, pesticide, there's more growth of weed, whatever. It is a very idea that there'll be diminishing returns. The moment you buy a very expensive iPhone, instant gratification. Next day, no value addition. Then third day, it feels as if you have owned it. You only created that iPhone. What? Diminishing returns. It is not giving you the same kind of validation every day that it gave you for the first time. The first time when you will have your salary in your bank account, you will feel like I'm going to own the entire world. And when we'll talk about your salary after 1 year, you'll be like, okay, this is very less. Law of diminishing returns. Everything, the output keeps on decreasing with time. Why does it happen? Because we are in a limitation. There's limitation all around it. And then how was he connecting it with the Malthusian trap? We are going to study in the next slide. So see in the first stage, what happens? In the first stage, there are so many different kinds of grains, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And there's this piece of land. Imagine that in this piece of land, I could have grown 10 different kinds of grain, and it was the best kind of land that I explored. It is the stage 1. So we are going back in time, way, way back in time. So the first land that I cultivated, it was very fertile. I could, have agriculture of so many grain supplies in a single quality of land, and it was so good. It was giving me a lot of, output. The quality of land, fertility, all of it was very good. All of that. Now, if quality of this land was more than sufficient to produce a supply of grains, then no rent. Again, we don't know what rent is, but say that no rent could be charged. There's something which couldn't be charged because land was infinite. And this was the best quality of land. And I was 10 different kinds of grain. Now, what is the price of grain? When you go ahead and buy wheat, or you go ahead and buy rice, what are you paying for? You're paying for labor that has gone in producing it, and you're also gone for you're paying for the capital, the entire industry that creates it, the tools that are needed to make rice, the tools that are needed to make the mill industry. You're paying for all of that, right? That is why the price goes up and down. So this was the first stage. Now the second stage, what happens is that the population starts to grow. Obviously, the population will start to grow. You'll discover more land. You'll want more land. You'll want to stay also in some land. You'll want to have homes in some land. You'll want to have, agriculture in some land, right? Normal, natural. So it will become insufficient for that perfect piece of land which I had in the first stage to supply the necessary amount of grain. So come to the second inferior quality of land that I can find. I go to the inferior quality of land and I'm like, okay, in the best kind of land, I was using 10 laborers. Here also, I will use 10 laborers. This is the quality of land I have. I can see that from the slide that doesn't look good. It was not as good as the previous one. But because the quality is not good, irrespective of the fact that I'm having the same amount of laborers, the quality of land is not good. So I am not able to produce 10 different kinds of grain. I'm using everything is same. I'm using the same kinds of laborers. I'm using the same number of laborers. I'm having very good kinds of tools and everything. I'm putting a lot of investment and training into it. But I'm not able to produce more than 3 grains because the quality of land is not good. And I have to go for it because population is increasing. I need more land, right? So here what happens is this simple thing: increase in per unit cost becomes more expensive for you. It becomes more expensive for you. Why do you have the idea of probation period in a company? You have an idea of probation period in a company, and then the company would want you to stay with them at least for the next 2 years, right? Why? Because the company is training you for the next 6 months or for the probation period. They're investing their capital, their goods, their tools, their knowledge, all of it in you, and then they want to take output out of you in the next 2 years. That is the value which is given. So you are okay. But the moment after 6 months of your probation, you decide that no, I want to quit, I want to go to another company, then you have become a liability. That is why you have the concept of what? Notice period, that you at least tell 1 month before. If you suddenly quit, then your salary will not be given to you. You became expensive suddenly. The same context, but just because you wanted to become expensive. So here, even though I'm using everything is the same. So I have every kind of student in the class. For some students, I will say one line and they'll understand it. For some students, I might have to invest more time because I don't know how to speak in Hindi. That is my demerit. That student understands Hindi in a much more comfortable way, right? So I will have to invest more. Then in the third criteria, you might have students who might have no knowledge, someone who's coming from science background, and I'm teaching something in arts. I'm teaching the same subject, but the amount of the quantity of labor which is going and the kind of tools that I'm going to use to make them understand is going to be different, right? So then I decide what is expensive for me or what is cheap for me. I'm not giving a I don't, any kind of comment. I'm just saying that in any kind of factory model of production of anything, I don't do factory model of education, so it was not for me. But I'm just saying that in any kind of, you make friends and then you understand that, oh, my friend is not giving me a lot of attention, waste of my time, very expensive, per unit cost is very expensive of this person, right? More labor is going into that, right? So it becomes expensive for them. They're going into loss. So why did because we still don't know what rent is. So why was suddenly what happened to Ricardo that he's starting to talk about all this rent and all of that? So the idea was that I told you that during the Waterloo Battle of Waterloo, when Napoleon was defeated, during that time there was this entire corn laws that were happening. I've discussed it in the previous lecture. In the corn law, what was happening was that how can you have the price of corn, and the corn, by corn I don't mean only corn, bhutta. I mean wheat, I mean grains, I mean everything. Corn is just a term which is symbolic for all of that. And it is still very important. In Arab countries, you had the entire uprising starting from the fact that the price of bread had increased. Price of bread is price of wheat in any country. So it can be very, it can galvanize a lot of protests even now. So it is not something which was only in 17th, 18th century. So the corn laws were repealed in 1840s after the death of Ricardo. But at that time, Ricardo was not able to understand one thing, that what is the relationship between land and corn? Like, what is the relationship between land and corn? Is it like he was not able to, for us, it is very easy to understand. But for him, it was because he's discovering at that point of time, right? So he says that is the land becoming more expensive because the corn is becoming more expensive? Corn is becoming more expensive because the land is becoming very expensive. What is becoming expensive? Whose cost is deciding the cost of the other? Suddenly, you had, just say, the places like Hoj Khas and Shapur Jat. These were not very elite places, and suddenly they became very expensive. What happened that the retail price increased? So Ricardo is not able to understand what is the connection. So he starts studying the idea of rent in this context. He wants to understand what is this relationship. I don't understand it, right? So he says, then he is able to study and he is able to scrutinize. He does his entire economic theories and predictions, calculations, models, whatever, being an economist, doing his survey, sampling, all of that. And then he decides that when the price of corn increases, then obviously you need more corn. For having more corn, you need more land, because we are talking about extensive population, more land. And then you need, when you need more land, land becomes expensive. There's a competition, right? So then he is able to understand that, okay, it is because of the corn that the price of land keeps on changing. Okay, I understand this. How does he understand it? We'll come here. So what is rent? So take these three countries. The definition of rent which Ricardo gave, right, was portion of produce of the earth which is paid to the landlord for the use of the original and indestructible powers of soil. So portion of produce of the earth. Portion of produce, obviously, India has a certain portion of produce of earth, whatever India's geography is. Whatever America's geography is, will have a different portion of earth's production. Then you have Russia. Look at Russia at the map. Look at China. They'll have more land portion, right? Which is paid to the landlord. So you're paying that, what is rent? The money you are paying to the landlord for the use of that portion of land of the earth, which in its very nature is original. Original, obviously, you cannot have a duplicate land. It is original, and it is indestructible power of the soil. So Ricardo has this basic assumption that all land is fertile. There might be different values of fertility, but all land is fertile. So your fertility is the indestructible power, which you cannot remove fertility. Now you can, obviously, you have so many companies will go into the paradigm of that. But he's saying that all this is something which you don't own it, you don't give birth to it, you can't destroy it, right? We'll say, okay, wait, we'll have a nuclear bomb and we'll. What he is saying is it is the indestructible power of the soil, right? Which is being used in extensive agriculture. So here we have four countries. First is USA, the second is France, then you have India, and then you have Saudi Arabia. Land A, B, C, and D. Say the entire of America. So now his own, assumption is that the land of one country, the whole country should be used in one particular thing only, and that is agriculture. Because he has said that there are three classes in the society, which is the landlord class, the other is the capitalist class, and the third is the labor class, right? So he has to give precedence to land and the connection of land. And land is a very important identity for Jews. So Karl Marx is also Jew. So they'll talk about land. But the point, coming back to it. So in the first category, in the land A, which is America, they are able to create $500 out of that production. I produced a lot of grains, and it was $500. What was the capital and labor that was involved in it, which will go from my pocket? Say I am Trump. I want to produce a lot of my agricultural product. I can only produce agricultural product because it is the assumption of Ricardo. And I am gaining $500 a month. This is hypothetical. So $500 a month. Then I have to give money to the labor who was involved, the farmer, the peasant, all of that, the tools from where I got it. I can't do farming with my hand. So what is my net surplus? It is, or profit. But the term that he uses, Ricardo, is surplus, is 250. So $250 is the rent. $250 rent, which has been paid by the labor class indirectly, by the labor class, by the entire, factories, machinery, whatever, to Trump, who owns American land. They don't have ownership over that. This is rent. This is surplus. This is profit. This is what Ricardo says is rent. Now you come to France. France has different kind of land, obviously. Now different kind of land, they are able to have a production of agricultural produce which is $450 a month, right? So and we are keeping the capital plus labor constant in all the four cases, as you can see. It is $250 only. So then they are able to have a surplus of only $200. So Emmanuel Macron will say that, okay, I will get $200 out of it. Then you have India. India is produce agricultural production of $400 a month, and 250 is gone to the capital, laborers, and all of that. So Modi is having $150. These are different qualities of land. And in this particular paradigm, I'm saying USA is the most fertile. Though if you have land statistics, that is not true. But I'm just telling you in terms of an example. And then the last is Saudi Arabia. It is all desert. What kind of agriculture are you going to do? Right. So they are trying to have an agricultural production. Mohammed bin Salman is going to have an agricultural production, and then they understand that, oh, I'm not able to produce any agriculture. Right. So their capital and labor is $250. What is the profit? Zero. This is called marginal rent. But here, what exactly is the rent? It is the rent which the laborer or the factories don't have, the money which they don't have control over. It belongs only to the landlord. Right. And we see that it keeps on decreasing as the quality of land keeps on decreasing. In this hypothetical example, this is rent. Ricardo often calls it as surplus. Right? This is rent. So that is why I said that the rent that you pay to your landlord every month is, take it out. That is not right. Coming to the next slide, the criticism of Ricardo. Now the criticism of Ricardo is what all? The first criticism is that, listen, come on, Ricardo, look at us, 2020. We are using land for factories, home, mining, open office, oil drilling, God knows what all, right? We are not only using it for agriculture. So your assumption cannot be even assumed. You can't have land only for agriculture. First criticism. The second is that how you can say that fertility is something which is indestructible. So I hope you guys know about this company called Monsanto. You have to Google it. But what Monsanto does is that Monsanto is one of the companies which produces pesticides, or you can see like it has been bought by another company called Bayer or Bayer, and they produce pesticides or genetically modified crops. If you use them in your land, you're a very poor land farmer or whatever, and you use their pesticide and everything in your farm, Maybe the first year the production is very good, but the next year it will kill your land. And you can't have any other kind of pesticide or seed or whatever instead of replacement. It has changed the quality of your fertility of land. If you guys don't know about Monsanto, you should Google it. The eco-feminists like Vandana Shiva and the rural affairs journalist of Hindu, P. Sainath, who wrote Everyone Loves a Good Drought, they all have worked on Monsanto and given some kind of idea about it. So what are we doing? You can't have the land always fertile. Fertility is something which has to be maintained, right? So fertility is not finite in terms of like you have to, sorry, infinite. We have to use manures, we have to use pesticides, we have to use external things to improve it. Otherwise, there's a law of diminishing returns, no? So the law of diminishing return, the fertility will decrease with time. That is rent, and that is the rent theory. So basically what he's saying is that cultivation is basically what you get out of this rent theory. Cultivation is the first thing that you get out of this rent theory is that Ricardo says that there are three kinds of labor. Sorry, there are three kinds of classes in the society. The first class in the society is the landlord. The second class of society is the capitalists, the ones who are owning capital, which are the factory owners. And the third is the working class, which is the laborer. That is the first idea that the rent theory gives you. The second idea which the rent theory gives you is that rent is basically of the land rent that you pay. It is what? It is basically only surplus. It is basically only surplus, or you can also say profit, which belongs to whom? It belongs to the land owner. It also says that it has assumptions that all the land is fertile and all the land is only used for agriculture. He is not talking about so much about intensive agriculture. He's talking about extensive agriculture, that you need more land, more land. He also is able to understand that why you need more land, because the Malthusian trap which was there, that the population will not increase, people will die because of pandemic, lack of resources, lack of food supply. Slowly and slowly, what has started happening after 1750 or beginning of 1800 with the industrial revolution, the Malthusian trap has been broken out of. So now you have more population, you need more land. Land is something which you're not creating, it is limited in supply, there is scarcity. That is why it is going to have an impact on the price of land also. This is what you have to understand with the rent theory, and that's it. Now we come to comparative advantage. I have kept it very simple for you to understand. Otherwise, it is a very formula, graphic, and all of that. So what is comparative advantage? So say there are two people. One is Neha and Arvind. Neha is 25 years old and Arvind is also 25 years old. Neha takes 30 photos in an hour. And Arvind takes 40 photos in an hour, right? So according to absolute advantage, okay, there's some problem with students in signing in. Okay, the Neha is able to take 30 photos in an hour and Arvind is taking 40 photos in an hour. So what is absolute advantage for, but Neha takes 5 hours to cook a dish and Arvind is able to cook a dish in 1 hour. So what they have decided, that our absolute advantage is that I am Neha, I'm going to take pictures, and you are Arvind, you become a cook. We play with the gender fluidity in this class. So we are going to, this is the roles that we are going to do. And whenever I feel hungry, I will ask food from you and I'll pay you. And whenever you want to take selfie taken, photos taken, whatever, you don't please take, because you'll, not be able to produce it with that finesse and quantity, whatever. So you take help from Neha. This is absolute advantage. So this is India or this is China. India produces very good amount of cotton in manufacturing garment industry, and China is able to produce very good amount of phones. So India will import Oppo phone, TikTok, all of it from China, right? And China will import all the cotton from India. That is absolute advantage. But now you have a twist in the story. What is the twist in the story? That you have comparative advantage. This. So Neha's father comes to her house in Delhi and says that, come on, who takes 5 hours to make something or cook something? I'll give you this gas stove and oven and everything, and now you can cook in 1 hour. And then Arvind will be like, oh my God, now she can take photos also very good and she can cook also in the same amount of time. No one gave me a camera till now, right? So what is happening? So the best thing would be for Neha is that, okay, you cook by yourself, you also multitask. So you cook by yourself and you also take a lot of photos, and then you can also start selling whatever you cook. If you cook well and people stay alive, you can start making money of it. You do not have to be dependent on Arvind anymore. Arvind has no choice here. Okay. So you don't have to be dependent on him anymore, right? But in actual reality, there's an opportunity cost. And to meet with that opportunity cost, they should continue with the previous. Why? Now, for example, Neha has to initially, what was her expenditure in doing photography? Initially, her expenditure of doing photography was first was the investment of buying a DSLR, then buying different lenses, which are very, very expensive. That is also your investment, right? Because what is it? It is capital. What are you doing? You're doing labor. What is the product? Photography. So first investment was buying in the camera, then the investment was, okay, lens, then the investment would be buying the battery of the camera, the charger, the memory card, whatever you have, all these technical equipments. That was also investment. And then she was able to produce photos out of it. But now she has a gas stove cylinder. So every 1 month she has to buy another cylinder. Then she has to buy more if she starts getting into the, like the business of cooking and selling. Then she also has to buy more pots and pans so that she can cook for more people. So now, even though her father gave all of that for free, she has to constantly put some money in maintaining it, right? She has to buy more gas cylinder, more food supply, more food that she has to cook, more vegetables, more grocery items. So here again, her investment is increasing. And what is the guarantee that the food that she is cooking is going to be, very good? It will become it will have a brand of itself. People are going to eat it. There's no guarantee of it. But in that amount of time where she is putting a lot of money in, getting a cylinder, cleaning it, getting more groceries, doing something new, what she's not good at, in that amount of time, she could have used her labor for making more photographs, which are already a hit in that market. So even though this entire tool or capital is free, there is a maintenance cost which is involved. This investment in the maintenance cost is not doing a lot of, in the longer period of time, this maintenance cost or whatever might not give her profit. So why waste time? You continue with the entire, it is easier for you to continue with the entire earlier system, right? They don't give me the example that yes, now they can go marry, because marriage also follows the law of diminishing return. But the idea is that now you can continue with the entire structure which was there before. Say, for example, you are a topper in your class. You have the capacity to study everything one day before examination and still top. But then your comparative advantage would be that you don't study all of by yourself. You go into these group discussions with other people where you just discuss the main rudimentary parts of the topic, and you are able to revise it. You don't have to invest all the labor by yourself, and you are learning also. That is your comparative advantage, right? This is the idea of comparative advantage. But one thing which you have to understand in comparative advantage is that I am again looking at cost per unit. Cost per unit here means that how many photos in an hour, how many dishes in an hour. I'm looking at quantity again. Here again, I have not used quality as a term. So I have to produce more in less amount of time. That is the idea of profit. So, for example, I suddenly want to go to, say it is summer vacation right now, and in a normal world, I want to go to Bombay. And then I suddenly come to know that, oh, the time in which and I have booked my ticket and everything else. But in the time that I had to go to Bombay, I realized that there's a very big conference happening in Delhi. Sorry for giving a nerdy example, but there's a big conference happening in Delhi. So I decide to go to the conference in Delhi and not go to Bombay for those 1 week. What did it cost me? It just did not cost me my taking a Uber and going to the conference and spending my time and my labor for 3 days or 5 days in that conference, and that's it. It also costed me the amount or whatever I had invested in the previous idea of going to Bombay. Even if I get a refund, I'll not get the entire refund, but even if I get a refund. So the opportunity cost of a particular thing is not just doing that thing, but the earlier thing which also you had planned in that particular time assigned to you. So it is costing you more. It is not costing you less. So pandemic is costing us more. Not right. So cost per unit, maximum productivity in least amount of time. That's it. No quality. So now he says, now we are towards the end of it. He talks about the law of diminishing returns as we saw, right? How can it be stopped? How can you control it? There has to be some solution within the problem itself. How do you control it? So he says that there are two ways in controlling law of diminishing returns. One is technical progress. You have more technology, better technology. But Ricardo is able to understand that the more technology you'll have, the less labor you'll need. So you'll be having job cuts, right? And the second is the technology that you're going to buy is going to be expensive. So there will be some cut in the salary of your laborers also. So he understands that technical progress is not labor friendly. But his idea is not about, see, again, what Marx will say that you know all of that and everything, but you never thought about labor at all. The socio-economic human origins of that labor. You know that there'll be wage cuts, so that person will be fired if the technology is bought. But then Ricardo will say that I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how we can have more productivity in less amount of time. My concern is that I am not concerned about your labor. And the other thing he says is that you should have more foreign trade because you're having comparative advantage. So now instead of Neha and Arvind, you imagine America and India, right? America wants a lot of Indian students to come and study in American universities, which are very expensive, right? And India wants a lot of American companies, FDI. I want Amazon, I want Uber, I want any American company, Netflix, Facebook, Twitter. Oh my God, so many. So the point is that you need to have, how will you limit, how will you control, how are you going to eradicate the law of diminishing returns in your country? You trade with another country. It is good for your comparative advantage also, right? You're doing good in your specialization. You outsource. So why did outsourcing work? So I don't know if you guys know, but outsourcing as an idea was not started with India and third world countries. The first cities or the first countries where outsourcing was experimented was in Canada and Israel. And then over a period of time, it was China, and then it is India. Right. So what was it? That if, for example, there are 10 employees working in an American company and they are getting the salary, which will be expensive, say they are getting $100 a day, and they are able to produce 100 things. But if you outsource it to India, you have to pay the Indians $10 a day and they are going to produce more, 200 products. Outsourcing, comparative advantage to me. The beginning of outsourcing was comparative advantage. And I can go ahead with inventing more technology firms and companies and organizations, right? He also says that if you don't have foreign trade and if you don't have a new technology, if you don't have technological progress, what will happen is this, that you will create a state. So there are two spellings of stationary. Stationary here is what? Stagnant. The stationary state. If I would have said stationary, which is stationary with an E, then I'm talking about pen, pencil, rubber, cutter, all of that. So the stationary state is a stagnant state where the capitalists are not able to accumulate any capital. There's no profit. Nothing is profitable. They have been following the law of diminishing returns and not being able to do anything, that towards the end of it, as time goes ahead, they are not able to make any profit. So that is a stationary state where you can have no growth, no value addition, nothing. Pandemic is creating stationary states to a certain extent. Now we come towards the end of the PPT, thank God. So what happens is that there's this paradox between classical and neoclassical economics. Classical and so classical economics is talking about labor, capital, all of that. I have no idea what neoclassical economics is talking about. You have to Google. There's this paradox of water and diamond, with which I'll end. What is the paradox? Diamond, which has less utility, right? Diamond, which has less utility, is more expensive. And water, which has the most utility, you will die without water in a couple of days. I don't know the scientific data, but it is not that expensive. I'm talking in the context of India. If you go to Middle East and the airports over there, water is sold for like 5 liters for $10, and I'm like, oh my God, come to the desert. No, but the point here, why water is never going to be as expensive as a diamond. That okay, this bottle of water is going to cost you 1 crore rupees, and then I will die. So the paradox which I'm ending the slide with is that you have to Google and figure out what is neoclassical economics, and the second is what is this water diamond paradox and how can it be solved. And we'll discuss it in the next class. So now we are ending with it. What I'll do is I'll upload this on YouTube for the students, because of the electricity and many things. Many students were not able to enter. There are issues. They can go ahead with it because this class is very, very important. Much more important than, because this is what Marx is going to build his theory on. So it is very important. The second is we are also going to talk a little bit about neoclassical economics before we start with Marx, so that we understand that what happened when what was the economic time when Marx was talking about, right? So we are ending with this. This is the Twitter handle. Please follow it, because I keep on tweeting a lot of interesting things. And the second thing is that if you have any query on the email ID that I write to you with, or this one, you can get back to me and we can have any kind of discussion and everything, which will be, like if you don't understand something, you can go ahead and ask me. Yes, so now I have to pause it. Okay, thank you.